Let me tell you something that nobody prepares you for when you become a father. Nobody sits you down and warns you that the deepest wound you will ever carry won't come from a stranger. It won't come from a boss who passed you over, or a friend who disappeared, or even a world that sometimes feels like it has no room for a man your age. No, the deepest wound comes wrapped in something familiar. A voice you've known since it was too small to form words. A face that has your own eyes staring back at you, and a sentence you never thought you'd live to hear. Dad, Derek doesn't think it's a good idea this year. My name is Robert Bennett. Most people who love me call me Bobby. And this is the story of the Christmas that cracked my life clean in half, and the 7 years it took to find out what was living on the other side of that crack. Stay with me, because I promise you, it ends somewhere nobody saw coming. It was Christmas Eve, 2016. I was standing in my kitchen still wearing my work boots, holding my phone the way you hold something that has just turned on you. I'd called my daughter, Kayla, to confirm what time she needed me over for dinner. We'd done it every year since her mother, Gloria, passed away. Every single year without exception. Roast turkey, bad holiday movies, Kayla burning the crescent rolls and me pretending not to notice. Simple. Hours. She picked up on the third ring. I knew immediately something was wrong. I have been Kayla's father for 27 years. I know every frequency her voice operates in, and this one tight, careful, like a woman reading from a script was not a frequency I recognized. I said, "Hey, sweetheart, just calling about tomorrow. You need me to bring anything? I was thinking I'd swing by Franklin's Bakery and grab that sweet potato pie." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. Then she said, "Dad, Derek doesn't think it's a good idea. This year." I actually laughed, out loud, genuinely, because I was absolutely certain she was joking. "Derek doesn't think Christmas is a good idea? You two didn't really hit it off at Thanksgiving," she said. "And he needs space. In his own home. His own home." I want you to let that land for a moment. His own home, the one I helped them make a down payment on 3 years prior. The one I spent a long weekend painting because the contractor they hired never showed up. But I kept my voice even. I said, "Kayla, I'm not coming to visit Derek. I'm coming to see my daughter." She went quiet again. And when she came back, her voice had shrunk down to something I barely recognized. She said, "Dad, please don't make this harder than it already is." That was when I understood. She wasn't asking me to stay away. She was telling me, and somewhere in the background, so faint I almost convinced myself, I imagined I could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The footsteps of a man making sure the job got done right. I said, "Okay, Kayla." Just that, okay. Because what else do you say when your daughter, your only child, the person you have centered your entire life around, tells you that another man has decided you are not welcome at her table on Christmas? I hung up. I stood in that kitchen for 4 full minutes without moving a muscle. Then I looked around at the house Gloria and I built a life inside. And I thought, I am not spending Christmas staring at these walls. I drove to Colton's Diner. It's a little family place about 2 miles from the house. Nothing fancy. The kind of restaurant where the menus are laminated, and the waitress calls you Han, whether you like it or not. It was Christmas Eve. The place was half empty. Soft music playing overhead, some old Nat King Cole. I sat down at a table for 2, which felt unnecessarily cruel. I ordered the pot roast, coffee, black, and I told myself I was fine. A composed, dignified 62-year-old man eating pot roast alone on Christmas Eve. Totally, completely fine. Then the waitress brought the bread basket, leaned over and said warmly, "Just you tonight, sweetheart." I said, "Just me." She gave me the look. You know, the one, that tender, helpless, "Oh, you poor thing" look that kind-hearted people genuinely cannot stop themselves from giving you. I was about 2 seconds from asking for the check. That's when I heard her. A woman's voice, big, bright, completely unself-conscious, called from across the restaurant. "Hey, sir, yeah, you the blue jacket." I looked up. A woman, maybe mid-40s, was waving at me from a table near the window. She had natural hair pulled back, warm brown skin, and a smile that took up her entire face, like it had never once been told to be smaller. Beside her sat 3 kids. A young man who looked about 19, focused entirely on his phone, a teenage girl with her arms crossed like Christmas had personally offended her, and a little boy couldn't have been more than 8 wearing a paper crown from a Christmas cracker with the absolute confidence of a king. She said, "You sitting over there alone?" I looked behind me, then back at her. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, that's ridiculous," she said. "Come sit with us. We've got enough food to feed the whole block. And Jordan over here eats like a sparrow every time his phone's in his hand." The young man Jordan looked up just long enough to say, "I eat fine, Mom," then went straight back to his screen. The teenage girl Brianna stared at me, then turned to her mother. "Mom, you cannot just invite random strangers to our table." The woman, I would learn her name, was Vanessa Coleman, but everyone called her Nessa, pulled out the empty chair beside her, like the debate was already over. "I just did, baby." I don't know why I stood up. I genuinely cannot explain it to you even now, all these years later. Maybe I was exhausted by my own company. Maybe something in me recognized something in her, that specific stubborn warmth that refuses to let the world be cold, no matter how cold it gets. I picked up my coffee. I walked across that restaurant. I sat down. "Robert Bennett," I said. "Bobby." "Vanessa Coleman," she said. "Nessa, and you look too sad to eat alone on Christmas. No offense. Some taken, actually." The little boy, the one with the paper crown, looked at me with the seriousness of a judge and said, "Do you know any good jokes?" "A few," I said. "Are they actually funny?" he said. "Or just dad funny?" Brianna didn't even look up. "Dad jokes make you groan. Actually, funny jokes make you laugh. There's a difference." I said, "Fair enough, let me think." And just like that, I was no longer a man eating alone on Christmas Eve. I was sitting at a table that had absolutely no idea it had just changed my life. By the end of that dinner, I knew everything about that family. I knew that Nessa's ex-husband had walked out 14 months earlier without much of an explanation. I knew that Jordan was trying to get into community college for automotive engineering, and that the phone habit was a nervous one, not a lazy one. I knew that Brianna wanted to be a lawyer and already argued like she'd passed the bar. And I knew that little Noah, the one with the crown, was missing his 2 front teeth, and considered this a profound injustice. Nessa knew I had a daughter I wouldn't be seeing that Christmas. She didn't dig. She just nodded the way people do when they understand that some pain is too fresh to poke at. When the check came, I reached for it. She said, "Don't you dare. You fed a stranger on Christmas Eve," I said. "The least I can do." "The least you can do," she interrupted, "is show up next Saturday. I make gumbo on the first Saturday of every month. Noah already likes you, and Noah doesn't like anybody." Noah nodded once, confirming, "Absolutely regal." I looked at this woman, this family, these 4 people with no obligation to me whatsoever, and I said, "I'll bring dessert." I had no idea that first Saturday would become 7 years. I had no idea those 4 people would become the truest family I'd ever known. And I had absolutely no idea that one phone call 7 years later would rip open everything and finally show me what Derek Lawson had truly been doing to my daughter all along. Let me tell you something about 7 years. 7 years is long enough to forget the exact shape of loneliness. Long enough to stop flinching every time the holidays arrive. Long enough to build something so solid, so real, that you almost stop grieving the thing you lost. But here's what 7 years cannot do: it cannot hide a man's true nature forever. And Derek Lawson was about to find that out. That first Saturday, I showed up at Nessa's door holding a sweet potato pie from Franklin's Bakery, the same kind I used to bring Kayla. Nessa opened the door, looked at the pie, looked at me and said, "You're already my favorite person, and you've been standing here for 4 seconds. Noah grabbed the pie box before I could step inside. Brianna looked at him and said, "That is not yours." Then looked at me and said, "It's nice to see you again, Mr. Bennett." Very formal, very future attorney. Jordan was under the kitchen sink fixing a leak. Everything I needed to know about that young man I learned in that moment. I rolled up my sleeves and got under there with him. Nessa leaned in the doorway and said, "You done much plumbing?" "Raised a daughter alone for 12 years after my wife passed," I said. "I've plumbed, plastered, rewired a bathroom, and once performed emergency surgery on a Barbie dream house." Jordan laughed from under the sink. First time I'd heard him laugh. It sounded like the beginning of something. "Now, I need you to understand something because this next part matters. During all of it, all 7 years of Gumbo Saturdays, Noah's Little League games, helping Jordan study for his licensing exam, watching Brianna absolutely dismantle her high school mock trial competition, I never once stopped thinking about Kayla. I called her regularly. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't. When she did, the conversations were short and careful, like she was selecting every word from a peer-approved list. I'm fine, Dad. Derek's good. Work's been busy. I'll try to call more. She never did. I mailed birthday cards, Christmas cards, Easter cards. I never knew if she received a single one. Around year 4, I ran into her old college roommate, Latoya, at a grocery store. Latoya hugged me like she'd been holding it in for years, then pulled back and said, "Mr. Bennett, how is Kayla? I haven't been able to reach her in forever." I said, "What do you mean?" "I mean I've called, texted, sent a message through her work email. She just went completely quiet about 2 years ago. I figured maybe I said something wrong, but nobody could tell me what." I was standing in the cereal aisle holding a box of oatmeal. I said, "You're not the first person to tell me that." Latoya looked at me with something I can only describe as worried recognition. "Mr. Bennett, is she okay? Is he okay with her?" And there it was. The question I had been circling around for 4 years, but hadn't been brave enough to land on. I didn't have an answer. I gave Latoya my number, told her to keep trying, and drove home with a feeling sitting in my chest like wet concrete. That night, I told Nessa everything. We were on her back porch the way we always ended up after dinner, her with her tea, me with my coffee, the kids making too much noise somewhere inside. I told her about Latoya, about the cards, about the short phone calls, and the peer-approved words, and the feeling I couldn't shake loose no matter how many Saturdays passed. Nessa was quiet for a long time, which was unusual for her. Then she said, "Bobby, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think before you answer." "Okay." "In all the years since Derek told her to cut you off, has Kayla ever once reached out first? Has she ever called you without you calling her first?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. I sat with that question for 30 full seconds. Then I said, "No." Nessa set down her tea. "That is not a daughter who stopped loving her father," she said quietly. "That is a woman who has been told who she is allowed to love." I heard what she said. I just didn't know yet how right she was. Year 7, February, a Tuesday night. I was at Nessa's helping Noah with a science project, a baking soda volcano, because apparently every generation of children is legally required to make one when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered. A woman's voice, clipped and clinical. "Is this Robert Bennett?" "It is, Mr. Bennett. My name is Dr. Patricia Monroe. I'm calling from St. Andrew's Medical Center. I'm attempting to reach next of kin for a patient named Kayla Lawson. You're listed in her original emergency contacts. The volcano kit hit the floor." I said, "What happened?" "Ms. Lawson was in a serious car accident earlier today. She's out of surgery, but she's in critical condition." A pause. "Mr. Bennett, I have to be transparent with you. We've been trying to reach her husband, Derek Lawson, for the past 4 hours." Another pause, this one heavier. "We haven't been able to locate him." The wet concrete feeling came back, but this time it wasn't in my chest. It was everywhere. I said, "I'm on my way." From the hallway, Nessa said, "You don't have to explain. Get your jacket." Brianna appeared at the top of the stairs, read the room in approximately 2 seconds, and said, "We're all going." Jordan was already in his coat. Noah looked at all of us with those big, serious eyes and said, "Is somebody hurt?" Nessa kneeled down to his level. "Bobby's daughter needs him right now, baby." Noah looked straight at me and said, "Then we got to go, right?" I couldn't speak for a moment. I just nodded. All 5 of us drove to St. Andrew's Medical Center. A man and the family that chose him, moving through a cold February night toward a daughter who had no idea any of us were coming. Somewhere on the highway, Nessa reached over from the passenger seat and said, "Whatever we find when we get there, you are not facing it alone. You hear me?" I heard her. But nothing in the world could have prepared me for what was waiting inside those walls. Dr. Monroe met us at the 3rd-floor nurse's station. She was a compact woman, mid-50s, with tired eyes that had clearly seen too much of the world but hadn't gone cold from it. She looked at me, then at Nessa and the kids behind me, and I could see her recalibrating. I said, "They're family." She didn't question it. She just said, "Mr. Bennett, your daughter is stable. The surgery went well. She has a fractured collarbone, 3 broken ribs, and a significant concussion. She'll need time, but she is going to recover." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the phone rang. Then she said, "Can we speak privately for a moment?" She led me into a small consultation room, the kind with chairs that are too soft and walls that are too bare, and a box of tissues on the table that nobody ever wants to need. She closed the door, sat across from me, folded her hands. "Mr. Bennett, I want to be straightforward with you because I believe you deserve that. Please, when your daughter was brought in, the accident report indicated a rear-end impact at moderate speed. Her vehicle was pushed into a guardrail. That's what appears on the surface." She paused. "But during her examination, our attending physician noted several things inconsistent with this being her first trauma." I said, "Meaning what?" "There were healed fractures, old ones, a previously broken wrist that was never properly set, scarring along her left shoulder consistent with repeated impact over time." She held my gaze. "Mr. Bennett, we are required by law to file a report when we identify a pattern like this. The injuries we're seeing span several years." The room got very small. I said, "How many years?" She said, "Based on the bone density around the older fractures and the layering of the scar tissue, we're looking at injuries spanning at least 5 or 6 years." I sat in that chair and did the math I didn't want to do. And the math kept landing on the same answer, the same name. "Derek Lawson." I said, "Where is he?" She opened a folder. "A Detective Hayes from the county sheriff's office has been here twice tonight. Apparently, Derek Lawson was also involved in an incident this evening, different location, different circumstances. He is currently in police custody." I stared at her. "I don't have further details beyond that," she said. "Detective Hayes asked to speak with you when you arrived." Detective Hayes was a tall, unhurried man with a face that gave nothing away without charging for it. He shook my hand in the hallway and said, "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate you coming in. I know this is a tremendous amount to process." I said, "Tell me what's happening with my daughter's husband." He said, "Derek Lawson was picked up tonight, approximately 40 minutes after your daughter's accident. We had received a noise complaint from a neighbor 3 weeks ago. The responding officer flagged it as a potential domestic situation. We've been monitoring. Tonight, a witness at the scene of your daughter's accident called it in as, he looked at his notepad, not looking right. The witness stated the impact appeared deliberate." I said, "Deliberate? We are still investigating, but I want to be honest with you, Mr. Bennett. Derek Lawson has been very careful for a very long time. Whatever was happening inside that house, he made sure it stayed inside that house." I thought about LaToya in the cereal aisle. I haven't been able to reach her in forever. I thought about the short phone calls, the pre-approved words. I thought about 7 years of birthday cards that my daughter may never have been allowed to open. I said, "He isolated her." Detective Hayes looked at me steadily and said, "That is the picture that is forming." "Yes. I have felt real anger in my life, hot, sharp, the kind that flares and burns and fades fast. But what I felt standing in that hospital hallway was something different. It was slow, cold, the kind of anger that pulls up a chair, folds its hands, and decides to be patient." Nessa was waiting right outside the consultation room. She took one look at my face. She didn't ask a single question. She just stood next to me, close enough that our shoulders touched. That was enough. They let me see Kayla just after midnight. She was in a room at the end of the corridor, small and pale under that particular hospital light that makes everyone look fragile. She had a bandage along her collarbone, a monitor clipped to her finger, an IV in her left arm. And she looked small. My daughter, who had her mother Gloria's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, looked painfully, heartbreakingly small in that bed. I pulled a chair close and sat down. I didn't speak for a while. I just watched her breathe, counted the breaths the way I used to when she was a baby, and I'd stand over her crib in the dark, just making sure the world hadn't taken her while I wasn't looking. Then her eyes opened, slow at first, focusing, then landing on me. She stared like she wasn't sure I was real. Then she said, barely a whisper, "Dad?" I said, "I'm here." Her face went through 6 different emotions in 4 seconds. Then she said, "How did you? Derek told me you stopped. He told me you moved away, that you were done." I kept my voice very, very steady. "Kayla, I have called you every month for 7 years. I have sent a card on every birthday, every Christmas, every Easter. I never stopped. Not once." She lay there very still, processing, wrestling with it. She said, "He showed me a message from your number, saying you were done with me." I said, "Baby, that was not from me." The monitor beeped, steady, indifferent. She said, "I thought you gave up on me." And her voice broke on that last word in a way that broke something in me too. I leaned forward and took her hand carefully, working around the 4. I said, "Kayla, I have never given up on you. Not for a single day. There is nothing on this earth, nothing that could ever make me give up on you." Tears ran sideways across her face and disappeared into the pillow. She didn't make a sound. She just let them fall. We stayed like that for a long time. After a while, Kayla turned her head toward the door. Through the small rectangular window, she could see into the hallway. Nessa was out there, sitting in a plastic hospital chair, head tilted towards something Noah was whispering to her. Jordan was leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed, watching the corridor both ways like a man standing guard. Brianna was on her phone but positioned at exactly the angle where she could see the door to my room at all times. Kayla watched them for a long moment. Then she said, "Who are they?" I said, "That's Nessa Coleman and her kids, Jordan, Brianna, and Noah. Are they close to you?" I almost smiled. 7 years ago, I said, your father was sitting alone in a restaurant on Christmas Eve. A woman in a bright jacket looked across the room and invited a stranger to her table. I paused. I've had dinner at that table almost every Saturday since. Kayla's eyes filled again. She said, "They came here tonight, for you." I said. Nessa had her keys before I finished the sentence. Noah looked at me and said, "Then we got to go, right?" He's 15 now, still can't spell congratulations, but he'd walk through a wall without anyone having to ask him to. Something moved across my daughter's face, soft and devastated at the same time. She said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." "You don't have to." "No," she said, her jaw tightening. "I need to say it. I let him tell me who you were. I let him rewrite you, turn you into someone who didn't care, who had moved on, who was done with me. And I didn't fight hard enough to know the truth." She exhaled shakily. "He did it with everyone, Dad. LaToya, Aunt Renee, my friend Camille from work, one by one, until it was just him and me in that house, and I thought that was just what marriage was." I said, "That is not what marriage is." She looked at me. "I know that now." A quiet settled over the room. The good kind, for once. Then the door pushed open slightly, and a small voice said, Sorry, I made something." Noah stood in the doorway in his jacket, holding a piece of paper folded into quarters. He looked at Kayla with those big grave eyes and said, "I didn't have good paper, so I used the back of a pamphlet from the waiting room. But I made you a card, because Mr. Bennett says you're his daughter, and Mr. Bennett is basically my grandpa. So that makes you kind of like family, I think. If that's okay." Kayla looked at this 15-year-old boy holding a pamphlet card, and her whole face crumpled. She said, "That is very okay." Noah walked in, placed the card carefully on her bedside table, nodded once like a man completing a business transaction, and walked back out. Kayla laughed, soft and watery and real. The first real laugh I had heard from her in 7 years. I said, "That's Noah." She said, "I love him already." I said, "Everyone does. He considers it his natural right." Derek Lawson was formally charged 6 weeks later. The investigation uncovered what Detective Hayes had suspected: a pattern of coercive control, psychological manipulation, and physical abuse carefully hidden behind a polished public image and a charming, handsome smile. The deliberate nature of the accident was ultimately included in the charges. He had spent the better part of a decade building walls around my daughter, cutting away the threads that connected her to anyone who loved her, replacing her real history with his version of it, until she had nothing left to hold on to. But here's what Derek Lawson never calculated. He never calculated a woman in a bright jacket who sits down at a stranger's table on Christmas Eve and simply refuses to let the world be cold. He never calculated Vanessa Coleman, who decides in 30 seconds whether a person has a good soul and is never, ever wrong. He never calculated Jordan, who shows up without being asked and stands guard without making a production of it. He never calculated Brianna, who notices everything and says exactly what needs to be said. And he never calculated Noah, a boy who makes cards out of waiting room pamphlets, because the gesture matters more than the paper. Derek built walls. We built a family, and families have a way of finding each other through the rubble. Kayla came to Nessa's house for the first time on a Saturday in April. She stood at the front door holding a sweet potato pie from Franklin's Bakery. Nessa opened the door. She looked at the pie. She looked at Kayla. She looked at me. Then she pulled my daughter into a hug like she had been waiting 7 years to give it. Because in a way she had. Noah appeared around the corner, spotted the pie box, and his eyes went wide. "Is that from Franklin's?" Kayla said. "It is." He looked at her with solemn approval. Kayla looked at me with wide eyes. I said, "I told you. He considers it his natural right." She laughed. That real, full laugh. And somewhere between that laugh and the smell of Nessa's gumbo drifting through the front door, and Jordan setting an extra chair at the table without anyone asking him, to my life, which had cracked clean in two on a Christmas Eve 7 years ago, quietly and finally became whole. Nobody warns you about this part either. Nobody tells you that sometimes the family that finds you in your worst moment is not the one that shares your blood. Nobody tells you that a stranger's table can become the safest place you've ever known. Nobody tells you that a paper crown, a paper card, and a pie from a neighborhood bakery can be the beginning of something that heals what you thought was permanent. But I'm telling you now, the people who break your heart are not the whole story. They are not even the best part of it. Sometimes, if you're willing to pick up your coffee and walk across the room, the best part is still waiting.